Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome back for the last of our Wednesday night talks and Stations of the Cross. The actual last talk is going to be next Wednesday as part of the Soup and Scripture Supper. So there is just that one more final piece, which is going to be discussing the attitude of Christ as he approached the cross and as he approached the way of the cross. A couple of weeks ago, I got a very upsetting phone call that it's a complicated kind of friendship, but I have a little goddaughter, and I baptized her baby brother, and I found out that the baby brother's godfather Sorry about the delay. So I got the call to bury my little goddaughter's baby brother's godfather. He's only in his later 20s, maybe earlier 30s. And I could only open my comments to his father in one way. There's no human way to explain what he was going through. There's no human way to give him any kind of solace. And that's precisely why we came to the church. That's precisely why we brought the funeral body into the church, to find some comfort during Mass. Because what we were going through was so against what nature would tell us. What we were going through was so against what human nature would tell us, that the only way we were going to find any type of solace, the only way we were going to find any type of peace, was by turning to the divine. That we were somehow going to have to ask God to intercede, not only for this young man, but also to help us, if we couldn't understand, to accept, and to then move on with our own lives, and then to move on with what we had to do, keeping him as part of who we are and keeping him within our hearts. There had to be some answer that came not from ourselves, but from a higher power, from a higher reality, from some deeper type of understanding of human existence. It's difficult for any parent to watch their child die. It's difficult for any parent to have to accompany that child on that road to death. My sister was diagnosed with cancer and was told that there was nothing that they could do, that it just had to be lived out about 22 years ago. When she was within 2 months of death, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, was put into a hospice. My sister put into the same hospice room, and my mother died just a couple of months before my sister did. I'm convinced that part of the reason why she did that was that, having seen my sister through the illness, she didn't want to be there to watch her die. Maybe, she said, knowing my sister, I'd better get up there first. If not, she doesn't have a chance of getting in the doors. I can put in a good word with St. Peter and maybe kind of sneak her in a back door, open a window or something and let her climb in. But to think then of Mary, a young girl, by our standards, by the standards of the time, ready to get married and become a mother. Remember, she was already engaged to Joseph. They were already betrothed. Now, in the marriage ritual of the time, the betrothal was an unbreakable engagement. They signed the papers. This was now a marriage that was set. They were just waiting for a ceremony to kind of confirm it. But this was a legal marriage. That's why it says Joseph decided to divorce her quietly, because the legal bond had to have been broken. That legal promise had to have been settled. And then whatever Joseph offered as a dowry would have to have been returned. And she hears this message that she's been chosen to be the mother of the promised Messiah. Now, we hear all throughout scriptures about the Pharisees, about the scribes, about the doctors of the law, about the learned people who are watching the scriptures be fulfilled in Jesus and are not putting it together. They're not saying this is the Messiah. Now, some of them perhaps because of abstinence, but perhaps too because for some of them, those words didn't mean what we know they mean because we have 20/20 hindsight. They did not. So as Jesus is arguing with the Pharisees and the scribes, they haven't heard of the resurrection yet. They haven't talked to witnesses of the risen Jesus yet. They're looking at their understanding of Scripture. And they're saying, how come you're saying this means this means that? Even the whole conversation that Jesus had with Nicodemus. Before Nicodemus' conversion, Jesus is saying, you must be born from above. Nicodemus is saying, I must be born again. How does that happen? I can't climb back into my mother's womb. Something is wrong here. You can see that there's a lot of misunderstanding. So to think that Mary knew at the moment of the Annunciation that this is what was going to happen is at best simplist. She knew that this child was the Son of God because she knew that by the message of an angel that the child was being conceived by the Spirit. So she knew that this was going to be the child who would fulfill the promises of the Old Testament. But what precisely was that going to mean for her later on? Well, we really don't get a glimpse of that until a little bit later, and the most famous account of it is in St. Luke's Gospel, at the Feast of the Presentation. Now, unfortunately, St. Luke is the one who gives us the story of the presentation. St. Luke is a little bit mixed up. St. Luke was not a Jew. The presentation could not have been that had to have been taken care of on the 8th day. That had to have been taken care of long before Joseph, Mary, and Jesus are going into the temple. And if they were in Bethlehem for the census, you know that there were rabbis and modals around, so you know that taken care of. That was to mark him as one of the Jewish people. There's another rite within the Jewish tradition, and it's not the rite of the presentation of the child, it's the rite of the presentation and purification of the mother. Because during childbirth, there's the passing of so much blood that the mother then is rendered unclean. And she needs to be purified before she can take her place back in the temple. So what they were probably going to was for the ritual purification of Mary. Joseph would have taken Jesus into the temple, Mary would have gone through the ritual baths, and then they would have gone into the temple, and the worship would have begun for all of them together. Well, they would have been separated. The men and women would have been separated. But they're halted. They're halted by a man named Simeon. And this is what Simeon says. Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, "Behold, this child is destined for the fall and rise of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be contradicted. And you yourself a sword will pierce, so that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. And you yourself a sword will pierce." Now we're hearing that Mary is somehow going to be suffering with Jesus. And I don't think we see that moment anywhere as clearly as we do on the way of the cross. Jesus meets his mother on the way. She was with the crowds. She was walking from step to step. No doubt she was with John outside of Pilate's palace. No doubt she was with John every step of the way, that he was holding her up just as Jesus was being held up, that he was carrying her just as Simeon was helping with the cross. And no doubt that when they got there, she was very, very close. Close enough that when Jesus speaks to her and John from the cross, they can hear him. And there he fulfills that prophecy of Simeon. John is traditionally understood as a symbol for the church. So when Jesus says to Mary, "Behold your son," and he says to John, "Behold your mother," certainly he's saying, "You're the youngest of the apostles. Take care of my mother." And he's saying to her, he's the youngest of the apostles. Watch over him like a son. But if John is a symbol for the church, At that moment, too, he's also letting the church know that in the heart of Mary, there's a place of refuge. There's a place where they can go. There's a place where they can bring their pain. There's a place that has been opened, that has been pierced, so that the hearts of many can be revealed to her. And they would always know that they would have a loving, welcome place right there. But think of what she's witnessing. When I was ordained 44 years ago, back in the day of the giants, when I was ordained 44 years ago, a friend of mine came to be the deacon at my first Mass. Now, there was an older guy, not older, I mean, he was just about maybe 6 or 7 years older than me. But my friend Jay was from Jackson, Tennessee. He worked for a newspaper called the Jackson Sun, and he always used to get teased because he would have to call people up and say, "Hello, this is Jay Jackson from the Jackson Sun in Jackson, Tennessee," and he'd do it with this thick Southern accent. Well, when we were studying together in Rome, we became good friends right away. And for 3 years, 4 years, we worked together at a local children's hospital. We'd go visit once or twice a week. We would bring Mass there every week. And we'd have to do this in Italian. He loved folk music. And he got a little bit of a volunteer job playing folk music at the little church of Santo Spirito between our college and the children's hospital. And the pastor there, a Franciscan friar of the Atonement, who really was named Charlie Angel. That really was the man's name. I met him again after 30 years up in Graymore. It was great. That really was his name. What a good man he was. He needed a deacon to preach in Italian. So Jay volunteered me, and I started doing that. So it was only natural. When I was ordained, I asked Jay to be the deacon at my first Mass. And he said, "I'll do it on one condition." And I said, "Okay, what's that?" He said, "I read the gospel." Because I'm coming from Tennessee. And those New Yorkers need to know how English is supposed to sound. And I said, "The job is yours. The job is yours." I found out he came up from Tennessee by bus to be my deacon. Yeah, could you picture coming up from Tennessee by bus? I flew down to Memphis for his ordination. It was not going to be no 13 hours on a Greyhound. I wasn't going to try to do that. And I got to meet his mother, I got to meet his brother, and just good, kind, wonderful people. And his mom said to me, you know, his elder brother was a priest. And his mom said to me, "You know, I never thought my older boy was going to be the priest." He said, "You know, I didn't really want a priest in my family." And then one day, I see little Jay set up a table, put a cloak over, and I said, "Oh no, don't tell me him too. Don't tell me he's going to be wanting this too." Well, he climbed up on top of that table, jumped off, called himself Superman, and I was so relieved. About a year after that, I got a phone call. Jay had been murdered. And when the facts came out, Jay had been named a pastor in a parish and had gone out for dinner with the secretary. And when he came back to the rectory, he surprised a burglar, and the burglar put 2 bullets in him after beating him. And they were able to catch the man because they were able to match the bullets that were in Jay to the bullets from a gun that was stolen from a policeman when that man broke out of prison. So they knew who it was right away. I went down for Jay's funeral just about a year after he was ordained a priest. They couldn't use any of the churches in Memphis because there was none big enough, not even the cathedral. So they had to use a civic funeral. There were well over 100 priests at this funeral Mass. And Mass is going on, and we go through the consecration. Bishop Dozier was there. Bishop Carol Dozier was in charge of Memphis at the time. And we just finish with the Eucharistic prayer. We say the Our Father, and there's a stop. And the pastor, Jay's pastor, goes over to the microphone and says, "I have an announcement to make. We have just been informed that the man who killed Jay has been captured. And he's in the courtroom right across the street from this auditorium. And right now he's being arraigned. And Mrs. Jackson wants me to give you all one message. She said, in your hearts, forgive the man who killed her son, or do not share the sign of peace with one another. Forgive the man who killed her son. If not, don't share the sign of peace with one another. From where comes that faith? From where comes that courage? My buddy Matt lives down in Florida. We've known each other for over 30 years. He has one brother and he had 3 sisters. One of his sisters died of one of the childhood diseases many decades ago. I know my own uncle died of tuberculosis around the 40s. I don't know what she died of. I think it was some type of a blood disease that they hadn't yet diagnosed. Years later, Jay and his mother moved down to Florida. His sister moves down to Florida. The other sister's in the military. And now we're talking maybe 20, 30 years later, we're talking maybe about, 20 years ago. His younger sister is diagnosed with cancer. And she's told that the treatments have stopped working and that it was just going to be a matter of time before she would die. And his mother was told that she was going to lose her second daughter. I get a phone call from Matt. Can you fly down? I said, sure, Matt. What's going on? I said, you sound very serious. He said, my sister, she's dying. I said, I'm on my way. I said, let your mom know that Mindy's going to be okay. He said, it's not Mindy. My other sister. She was in a motorcycle accident. We're in the ICU right now. So I fly down there, and I meet them in the ICU. And the doctor comes out and says, with the passage of time, with the damage that's been done, there's not going to be anything we can do. She's only alive now because of the machine. You're going to have to make a decision. She will not get better. She will lay like this for who knows how long. And his mother came over to me, and she looked me in the eyes, and she said, did that man just tell me that God wants all 3 of my daughters? And I looked her in the face and I said, that's precisely what he just told you. And she looked at me and she said, well, then I have to let her go. I can't tell him no. Where do you find the courage when it defies human logic? The only way to find the courage is to find it from above. The only way to find the courage for that kind of acceptance is when somehow you're aware that very much God is operative in this moment. When your own faith is strong enough to say, there's more going on here than I can see just with the human eye. But that somehow, even in something that is baffling me, God is present. If we look at nature, what's the role of a parent? The role of the parent is to care for the child and then ultimately empower and enable that child to go out on their own, to be able to develop a life of their own. When the little baby bird is ready, Mama bird says, "You're out of the nest," and kicks it, pushes it. And then that baby bird realizes that it can do what it didn't think it could do before, and it begins to fly on its own. And sometimes those babies come back and take care of their parents. But because they've been empowered to be strong individuals themselves, because they've been empowered to form their own life and then make their own choices. Mary had to find her courage in the purpose that Jesus had. She had to find her courage in the understanding that Jesus came to be about his Father's business. Remember back to that story of Jesus being found in the temple? What does Mary say? "Son, you had us worried. How could you do this?" And he looked at her and said, "Well, why would you worry? Didn't you know that I had to be about my Father's business?" And then the scriptures say that she and Joseph pondered these things in their hearts. She was the one who said to him at the wedding at Cana, "They have no wine." And just like the baby bird saying, "I'm not ready yet," he said, "Well, that's nothing to me now, is it?" And she just looked at him and said, "Do whatever he tells you." She pushed him out of the nest to work his first miracle, to begin what he had to begin what he had to do. She found her courage to accompany him because she understood that he had a purpose. There's a wonderful film called Stalag 17. I'm sure some people here have actually seen it. It was about a concentration camp, and called Stalag 17, and it was just American servicemen who were in it. And there was one barrack number 4, where they came to realize that in their barrack there was an informant. There was someone who was getting messages to the German soldiers. And they didn't know who it was, but they knew that someone there had been planted. And there was, everybody's hero, and there was the guy who was in charge, but there was one guy who was kind of like the shady creature who, much more of a loner, didn't have much to do with anybody else. So of course the presumption was he did it. And he even got a good beating because they presumed he did it. Well, that was just his personality. And one day he's kind of like off to the side of the barrack, and he sees the guy who is the informant passing a message to one of the German soldiers. He goes to the others and says, "You want to know who the rat is? I'll show you how he's doing it." There's a scene just before, and it's right after the wrong guy got beaten, that the head of the barrack is talking to the informant, thinking he's everybody's buddy. And he says to him, "I don't understand it. How can somebody do this? How can somebody voluntarily live in these conditions?" And the guy turns to him and says, "Because he has a purpose. A man can live under any conditions if he has a purpose." That's what we're going to talk about next week. The purpose of Christ was the fulfillment of John 3:16. God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. Why? So that those who believe in him would not perish but could have eternal life. Mary knew that there was something about Jesus. Mary saw him work his first miracle. No doubt Mary went when he was teaching in the synagogue at different times. No doubt Mary was going to be within earshot. No doubt when they were singing Hosanna to the Son of David, Mary was very proud of her son. No doubt, no doubt, no doubt that Mary was hearing all the things that Jesus was doing. But she also was very much aware of all the people that Jesus was upsetting. And she had to be aware that one day this could backfire. And she knew that this man would be destined for the rise and the fall of many. She knew he had a purpose far greater than what any one of us, perhaps even far greater than she herself understood. But she was his mother. And as his mother, she was going to support his purpose. As a mother, she was going to be the one who, more than anybody else, was going to back him up in what he had to do, and what had to be done as his mission statement. Because when the angel Gabriel appeared to her, she said simply, "Fiat, let it be done. Let it be done according to God's will." And she knew the scriptures enough. She heard the words of Simeon. Her purpose was to bring Jesus to the world. Her purpose was to be the vehicle through which God's healing work of salvation would begin. But as it unfolded, his purpose involved the cross. And as a woman of faith in Jesus, she had to support him as he did what he had to do to fulfill his mission and live out what the Father sent him to do. Her role was to bring him to the world. And from the cross, he made her the vehicle for bringing the world back to him, because he entrusted to her his church. The invitation during this Lenten season is to keep it always in mind that we too are part of a much bigger plan. We too are a part of a much bigger plan in God's design. And that each of us somehow fits into that history of salvation. And if we're going to fulfill our own part in God's plan, then it will mean the acceptance at times of suffering, and at other times the acceptance of joy. Mary had a purpose, and because of that purpose, she could accept and endure all things. So as painful as it was, she accompanied Jesus with the eyes and the love of a mother, hurting with him, being pierced in our own heart as he was pierced, but knowing that her suffering, just like his, was not for naught, but that it would lead to something even greater. It would lead to something grander in God's plan. For her, her heart was opened so that our hearts can be emptied into it. And for him, his suffering opened the gates of the kingdom. To see the cross through the eyes of Mary is only possible when we remember that all things are possible for the person with a purpose. Thank you again for listening to me tonight.